Hey, welcome back. And this is the second tutorial in the 5-minute tutorial series. And today we're going to talk about connecting to your enterprise or ArcGIS Online or AGOL, as it's sometimes called. So it all starts by setting up your environment. And in this case, we have to import our GIS class. And our GIS class is going to be the way that we access the either the enterprise or ArcGIS Online. So we do from arcgis.gis and import the class GIS. And the GIS object exists within that GIS sub package, submodule, or package, and it's part of the ArcGIS API for Python. And this is the object that's going to allow us to connect to either our enterprise, which is Portal, or ArcGIS Online. And you can connect to sites either providing some sort of credentials or by using an anonymous connection if it's allowed. There are different parts to the GIS class, and a single GIS object, you're allowed to create more than one, represents a single ArcGIS Online organization or ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. The GIS object provides basically utilities and tools to search, create, and get information with such as content, users, and groups. The constructor of the GIS class takes multiple inputs, but the most common tend to be the URL, which is basically where your site exists within the World Wide Web. We have our username and password. So if you're using various forms of login that require username and password, you put it in there. PKI, you can pass your key file and your certificate file. And then if you're using OAuth 2, you can either provide a client ID. And then there's an additional parameter called profile, which is probably not common to most people with logins. And one of the things that the GIS profile can do is it allows you to save your credentials to the operating system's credential store. And we'll cover that a little later. So from the first tutorial, we saw how to log in using anonymous connection. That's just basically you instantiate the class and you're connected to ArcGIS Online. Anonymous users cannot do certain things. They can't save and publish items. You can't persist web maps. And, and you can't access private information within your organization or somebody else's. So let's say we have our enterprise out there, and this is the demo site that's provided by Esri. And you do GIS, and we pass in our URL, and we're connected to our enterprise, Python API playground.esri.com/portal. That's our GIS class. So it shows you where it's pointing to through the representation of the class. To do the same thing for ArcGIS Online, you would just take our take a variable, in this case GIS underscore AGOL equals GIS. And now we're connected to ArcGIS Online. You can do a lot of stuff by being an anonymous user. You can do single line geocoding for a few addresses. You can view information. So that means you have this wealth to a large collection of information, whether it's on free and shared amongst the different organizations that exist within ArcGIS Online, um, or it's provided by Esri itself. But you can't persist data, and you can't save it for later use. So every time you'd be rebuilding this content every time you went to it. So let's look at the next thing in when it comes to logging in, and these are called built-in users or username and password. For any website you go to these days, they usually require some sort of login. Like, for example, Gmail. You provide your username and password, and then you can go in and access your email. It's the same concept for built-in users. So it'll expand upon when you provide these named users. Uh, it expands upon what you can do. You can do everything anonymous users can do, plus some more. So in this case, to log in, we're going to provide that username and password. So we do GIS, we provide a username and a password. This will connect to ArcGIS Online. If we wanted to connect to Enterprise, we have to provide one additional piece of information besides the username and password, a URL, so we know where to point to connect. And just in case you didn't notice that these are fake usernames and passwords. Okay. If you use PKI or public key infrastructure, um, this basically requires you to have certificates, and in order to do that, what you do is you would create your GIS object and then pass in your cert file. And then you would provide a password for your secure certification if it's required. And then you would connect to your site and it would see that you are you, and it would allow you to access as if you were to pass in your username and password. It supports other authentication modes such as LDAP, IWA, which is Integrated Windows Authentication, NTLM, Kerberos. And there's also OAuth 2 and SAML. So when you're accessing through IWA, NTLM, and Kerberos, the ArcGIS API for Python will automatically detect that it's there, and it'll try to use your username as if when you're on the domain. If you're outside the domain, it would the GIS object would require you to pass in your username and password as if you were a built-in account. One additional way not shown here is that you can log in using ArcGIS Pro. So if you have ArcGIS Pro installed and you're connected to an active portal, instead of typing in URL, username, and password to connect, you would just type GIS and the word Pro, and then that would go ahead and it would get all that connection information for you for the site that you're logged into through Pro. Another important fact, especially if you're an administrator and let's say you're setting up a portal, is the concept of verifying certificates. When a site's installed, ArcGIS Pro, sometimes the SSL certificate can be expired or invalid. And one of the steps when you build a site is installing your SSL certificate. So you can set the verify cert to false to ignore the certificate errors. But in production, when you work with it, you really don't want to do that. And this is done by doing it on the GIS object. So you would just do GIS, and we give our username and password along with our URL to connect to our enterprise, and then we set verify cert equal to false. Now if it encounters an invalid SSL certificate, it'll ignore it and continue on. So I mentioned before this concept of profiles and how you can work with them. And profiles are going to allow us to store our information within our operating system's credential store. And you do this all the time if you think about it. If you're in Chrome or some other browser and it offers to store that information, it's leveraging your operating system's credential store. So this isn't any different than anything else. So we're going to go ahead and create our first GIS class again. So we're going to provide GIS, provide our URL to our enterprise. If we were connecting to ArcGIS Online, we wouldn't have to do that. Provide that username and password, and then a profile name. And this would create an entry within our Windows credential store. It'll persist a bunch of information. So it'll persist the URL, username, key file, and cert file and client file in this .arcgis profile, but the passwords will be stored in that secure credential store. Now, anytime you want to go back and use this profile, you can exclude the URL, username, and password, and just do GIS and pass in profile, and then the profile name that we created. So now when you share workflows, and we'll see this as the tutorials progress, you'll only be sharing your profile name and you won't be sharing any credentials at all. This is a great way to share notebooks and scripts with others without having to worry about your credentials ever being baked within that script. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and have a good day.